Pandemics. It has been 2 years now. While seeing the news early morning today, I saw that on the same day 2 years ago, which is 14th of February 2020, in Europe, the first death from COVID-19 was announced in France. Realizing this fact makes me feel that I already became mentally habitualized in coexisting with pandemics by now. It has been changing every little details of our lives. We have witnessed unexpected increase in using online meetings. Sometimes, unfortunately, we heard some depressing news from the loss of the close ones. And also, pandemics is causing pandemic fatigue by overly using online and computers. And just like what Dr. Henkin and I discussed in last episode, the boundary of the week and the weekend has become diluted. Personally, as I have to move on to different countries, I can say that I am a self-proclaimed quarantine expert by now. So living with pandemics for 2 years, I was curious. When did it all started? Is it possible to eradicate the plague? How did people back then reacted to the Black Death, the deadliest pandemic in history? Did they wear masks or undergo any lockdown policy? What are we misunderstanding about pandemics that the social media is exaggerating? How can pandemics make human more resilient, well-being, and more grounded in life? And finally, how do pandemics impact our perception on mortality? To solve these questions, I had a grateful chance to talk to one of the pandemics expert, Dr. Varlık. Dr. Varlık is a historian who studies diseases, medicines, and public health, particularly focusing on the history of the Ottoman Empire. She investigates the Black Death in unique perspectives of Mediterranean regions and argues often dismissed historical fact that the Mediterranean regions are the focal point of this Black Death. Her works are down below in the description. I highly recommend you to read about the article about the pandemics and the death. It's also in the description. So without further ado, let's widen our perspective and correct our preconceptions on pandemics with Dr. Varlık. I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation, Dr. Varlık.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
We are hitting the 3rd year of the pandemics. There has been a lot of chaos for you. It has been a busy time since you are studying in this field of study called pandemics. Maybe you have got a lot of requests to explain about these situations as a historian. So at the first time you heard about this pandemic, first originated in Wuhan, China, and then WHO announcing as a global crisis, what were your first reactions? And over the past 2 years, how has it changed as you see more and more?
Yeah, I mean, we all went through a lot of different phases of the pandemic, a lot of ups and downs. But if I want to think of the early days of the pandemic, in fact, even before the WHO declared it as a global health crisis and a pandemic, I think I was still, even early, in this early days, I was still interested in this phenomenon and just watching it unfold. In its early days, when we were only hearing about cases in Wuhan, China. In fact, when the world knew very little about it, I was just keeping an eye on the news to see what is going on there, right? In its very early days, trying to get a sense of whether this was going to reach catastrophic proportions or not. And it's in its early days, and especially because the information coming out of China was not entirely transparent, and I'm referring to only like the very first days of the pandemic. So everyone had some question marks, and none of us really knew much about what was going on. But quickly it became clear to everyone, including myself, I think, and just experts working on this question, that this was going to reach proportions that we can call a pandemic. In fact, even before a World Health Organization called it a pandemic, and it was announced on March 11th, I believe, of 2020, I was teaching a course on the history of pandemics. And with my students in the classroom, we announced the pandemic even before WHO did, because we could see all the signs for this event, becoming an international, in fact, a global phenomena, unfolding and spreading it. And we watched it real time. It was a horrifying experience, of course, for all of us. I think on a personal level, the level of, communities and then like on an emotional and psychological level, or international, like many different aspects of pandemics that we can, talk about in terms of how we each experienced it. But in terms of thinking about as a historical phenomenon, it was, already becoming a historical phenomenon in its early days, and studying it as a historical phenomenon in the classroom with my students, we find it fascinating to track its movements and its spread. In fact, very early on in the pandemic, Johns Hopkins University set up a dashboard for tracking the number of cases worldwide. And that was something that, my students and I would go and check the numbers every single day to get a sense of the development and the spread of the pandemic. But of course, after middle of March, it was already clear that, almost everywhere in the world, that this had reached pandemic proportions and it was going to affect our lives. And I'm just, only recalling the early days, the very beginning, in which, there was a lot of certainty, and like none of us really knew what it was going to be like to live in a pandemic. And of course, like everyone else, like on a personal level, and as a scholar, who's been working on the history of pandemics for at least the last 20 years, I think we didn't know what it meant to be in a pandemic of this proportion. None of us really, who's lived in the 21st century at least, or late 20th century and 21st century, knew what it meant to be in a pandemic. And so I guess, in that regard, it was surprising. It was terrifying. But at the same time, I think as the pandemic unfolded and kind of developed, and as we knew more about it, as I read scientific publications and listened to the experts myself, and continued to talk about this with my students and with popular, audiences in media involvements, I think it just gradually, I developed some insights about the current experience of the pandemic, but also it was helpful for me to think of past pandemics and to try to understand this particular, or this current day pandemic in a historical context. Again, I'm a historian, and so I think historically. But at the same time, I think it's also possible to think about the history of now, the history of the present, and thinking about our current day experience as a historical phenomenon in a historical context. So, I think that would be a quick answer to your question. But of course, there were many ups and downs, for me personally and my family and friends, close or further away. And I also had COVID myself in the very early days of the pandemic. Oh, wow. I had COVID even before WHO declared it a pandemic. I had, traveled, and I think during the flight I must have caught it. At that time, we in the US were not wearing masks or face coverings at that time, and we didn't even have COVID tests at that time. So I did not even have a chance to have tested. So this is, March 2020, very, very early on. By now, I think, we all developed as, a kind of pandemic fatigue, doing everything online, even though last summer was a little better here, partly in terms of, businesses open up and traveling becoming a little more possible, at least. So there has been different phases and ups and downs and on many levels, but yes.
You talked about your students and yourself first recognizing this meteoric spread of this pandemic. What were like a first moments, like first symptoms that this is becoming a global pandemic? Are there any like specific moments that during your class that you realized this is becoming a bigger problem?
Well, when we first heard of media reports and news about cases recorded outside of China, that was already the first sign that there was, already some international spread. But it was more or less, and again, I'm talking about its very, very early days as, the narrative of the pandemic unfolded. When we had news of COVID cases in Italy, was basically when people started talking more about this. But I have to say that even at that point, even when there were a very, very, when there was a very serious outbreak going on in Italy in particular and other parts of Europe, there was still, I think, just denial going on in the US. I remember talking to my students, again, this is perhaps, maybe second half of February, maybe late February to early March, 2020. And some of my students believed that it would never come to the US, even though there were early cases recorded in the US at that point, but they were not talking about community spread at that point. But, one of the reasons was because there was no mass testing. So, of course, when you don't test, then you will not be able to detect cases. In any case, I think there are a lot of, issues involved here, and among them, the kind of general perception and beliefs and, psychological and emotional response for someone who's never seen an event or an experience like this. It is kind of hard to imagine what it was going to be like to live in this. But of course, by now, I think we all know what it means to live in a pandemic. And in fact, I believe that for many years, we will have to just, build means of resilience, both on a personal level or a community level, or even globally, to learn how to live with this virus, basically, to learn how to live with it. So I think this is one of the tasks that we all need to learn.
Exactly. Talking about your early days of research and studies, like what sparked your curiosity and what made you start studying pandemics and plague at the first place?
Yeah, I mean, this has actually a very long story, meaning doesn't have a long story, but it goes back in time in my own personal past. And so I was basically an undergraduate student studying history. And even in my very first year, the freshman year of college, and I was studying history, and I started reading some historical texts. In fact, one of the earlier ones that had some material about plague was in a course on Byzantine history. And so I was reading the accounts of this Byzantine historian by the name of Procopius, who lived in the 6th century. And in one of his accounts, he was talking about a plague outbreak in Constantinople, in the city of Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul, where I used to live when I was a student, where I'm actually from. And so that plague outbreak in the middle of the 6th century, we name it Plague of Justinian, as part of the first plague pandemic historically. And so that account was really my very first introduction to plague. And I remember reading it again, just, as a very new to history, just starting out as a student. And I thought it was fascinating. So I wanted to learn more about it. And so I continued to read more about it in my other courses. I prepared projects for it. And then I already knew that I wanted to go to graduate school and study more about the plague. So yeah, it goes back a long time, more than 30 years.
So it started with the Justinian plague.
Exactly. Then, even though I don't work on Justinian plague myself, but that's how it all started. You're right.
And that it moved on to the Black Death, and then now it's COVID-19.
Yeah. I mean, I think I can still say that plague is really my main area of expertise. I don't think I can claim to be an expert on COVID. I can claim to be an expert on COVID as much as everyone else, because we're all, experiencing this pandemic. But generally speaking, my area of specialization is plague, epidemics, pandemics. Yeah.
Talking about the plague, like while I was researching, and also people in the internet was confusing because there are different interpretations on the plague. So how would you define plague as a historian?
Well, actually, maybe there may be confusion, and there's a lot of misinformation also going on the internet. But in fact, for specialists and for anyone who's done research about plague, there is really nothing confusing about it, and our knowledge today about past pandemics of plague is extremely precise, and we know exactly what happened. Plague, when we use the term plague, we're really referring to not just any catastrophic event that affected humans. Could be a disease or epidemic disease, or maybe any other sort. So I'm not using it in that meaning. I'm using it in the meaning of a bacterial infection, right? The disease that we call plague is a bacterial infection. In fact, it's a disease that still happens in the world today. So it's not an extinct disease. It's a disease that still continues to affect, even though a smaller number of people, but it's still around in our day, in the 21st century. So plague, this bacterial infection is caused by a bacterium by the name of Yersinia pestis. And we know about its historical occurrences. Our knowledge of past pandemics of plague is now very advanced and very detailed and very precise, even though there are still questions that we don't know entirely. What we know is that plague outbreaks affected human societies for at least the last 5,000 years. And that's a very long history in itself, and it even takes us to prehistorical period. So from the very earliest occurrences of plague to, again, a disease, as I mentioned, still occurs in the 21st century. For this 5,000 years of history is a very long time period to study the history of disease across the globe. And in fact, geography is important to think about here, because historically it's a disease of Eurasia, or let's call it Afro-Eurasia, because of the connectedness between those areas, historically speaking. But plague did not spread, as far as we know, did not spread to the New World until very late. In fact, until the end of the 19th century, plague was more or less, as far as we know from historical records, more or less limited to the Afro-Eurasian disease zone. but did not spread to the Americas or Australia or Oceania and other parts of the world. And that happens during the modern period, after the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But what we can say that it has a 5,000 years long history, at least in the old world, and it has more than a century of lifetime, we can say, in the New World and globally. So again, during the COVID-19 pandemic, all attention internationally was, of course, focused on COVID itself, but smaller outbreaks of other diseases have been also happening in the meantime. And even in the earlier days of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were outbreaks of, in fact, 2 different outbreaks of Ebola and measles going on in African countries, including Congo. And there was an outbreak of plague later on in November 2020 in Congo. So yes, we are in a pandemic and almost finishing our second year in it, and it's important to know more about it. But at the same time, COVID has in a sense masked or covered or suppressed our ability to know more about what is going on in terms of other diseases in different parts of the world. But yes, plague is an old bacterial infection. What I can add to that is that despite its long evolutionary history, it's a bacterium, the bacterium that causes plague, Yersinia pestis, is a very slow evolving bacterium. And because it evolves and mutates very slowly, and in fact, there is really no comparison to something like COVID that evolves extremely and mutates extremely fast in comparison, plague has remained more or less stable over the course of a very long time, which is actually something helpful for us in trying to track and trace the evolutionary changes and developments in its genetic structure, so that we can study its history better. And in a way, it kind of collaborates. Our understanding of studying plague through historical sources can be brought together with its study by means of paleogenetics. So I mean, we can talk more about this if you think this would be something of interest to your listeners. But for this reason, we can study it and understand its changes better.
So talking about like different approaches considering the pandemic, I also heard that you are trying to take a multidisciplinary approaches towards understanding the pandemics and also plague. So what else do you try to study and research while also understanding the history of plague?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for this question. I think, by now, we all know from our current day experience that you cannot understand a pandemic from a single approach, right?
Yes.
Because we're talking about very complex phenomenon that has very different components and very complex history, right? Even our current day pandemic has now a massive history that it built, even if it's only 2 years. Its social aspects, its economic aspects, its political implications, its biological, epidemiological, emotional, psychological, you can just name it. So many different aspects to it. And of course, when we study past pandemics, we need to keep an eye on the different components that form this phenomenon, because pandemics are complex phenomena. We need to be able to understand and study it as comprehensively as possible. For that, just thinking of that as a guiding principle in trying to understand and examine past pandemics, I turn to history, of course, because I'm an historian and I am trained as one, and I read historical texts to understand and to reconstruct historical phenomena. That's what I do as a historian. But at the same time, I see a very broad range of possibilities, basically trying to think of and learn from other disciplines in the way they study pandemics. And archaeologists have been working on this question for a very long time. Geneticists, paleogeneticists especially, have been doing the same. There is a lot of information coming from medical sciences, biological sciences, epidemiology, public health, zoology, so and ecology, all of these disciplines, I think, have something very important to offer for us to think about pandemics. And I think one important principle that we might need to keep in mind, and I keep repeating this to my students, when you think about pandemics or when you're trying to imagine a pandemic, past or present, right, you cannot only understand it through the perspective of the pathogen. Right? You can study a virus, you can study a bacterium, you can understand its behavior, its spread, you can study, all you want, you can understand all its biological characteristics. That's great. That's going to be very helpful. But it's not going to tell you the full story because you also need to understand society. Right? So in fact, what I find helpful, and what I keep repeating to my students, think about the two interacting with each other. Think about the disease, the pathogen, the virus, the bacterium, but also think about people and human societies. And it's not enough to study either one of them. When you only study them together, interacting with each other and their interactions, then you will get the full picture. Because diseases are constantly in interaction with human societies and with our bodies, right? Diseases affect us in a certain way, but in return, we also have an impact on diseases. So both the disease and the society, these are dynamic entities that are, that respond to each other. So I think it's kind of important to look at the interaction and think about it as a dynamic. And so that's why thinking about a pandemic, you will not get the full picture only by looking at text. Like you need to look at other components of it, and vice versa. So that's why it's very important to have an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary perspective to be able to understand a pandemic in as comprehensively as possible.
Yeah, because of the complexities of the pandemic, you also mentioned that to understand the spread of the pandemics and also disease and also plague, you said that we need to better be aware of the process rather than the result and rather than the superficial aspect of the spread. For example, your main argument is that not only understanding about the European history of how the Black Death has spread, you also stated that it's better to understand the previous and also the post Black Death process. So could you tell me more about how the process is important rather than the result of the Black Death and also other diseases?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for this question too, because I think it's important to think about the legacy past pandemics left behind today for us to think about pandemics. And I think the legacy of past pandemics is something that very much shapes our understanding, our examination, study, but also our imagination of pandemics. And today, I will start by giving an example, and that's actually, there are a couple of points I think I would like to emphasize here. One is that we have a tendency to think of pandemics as short-term phenomenon, as if they're like, events, catastrophic events that come and go. And this is not the right way of thinking about pandemics. The pandemics are long-term phenomena. And I've been trying to emphasize this, since the beginning of this pandemic as much as I can everywhere in my classes, because most people had the sense in the early days of the pandemic, most people had the sense that, COVID will come and like within a month or two, we're going to go back to normal. No, that's not how it works. This is a longer process, and it's prolonged, and already 2 years into it, and perhaps we're kind of developing ways of learning to live with it and normalizing it in some way, but we're still in the very beginning. So it's important to think of them as long-term processes. But why do we think, I want to take this one step further and questioning, why do we have this kind of imagination about pandemic as something that kind of, it comes and go? We almost want to think of it like an earthquake or a tsunami,
Yeah.
right? Something like a natural disaster. And I don't think this is the right kind of thinking about pandemics. If we continue to think like this, we cannot develop the right mindset, and we cannot really apply the right kind of public health measures that would be effective, right? You cannot think of it as a short-term problem that comes and goes. So I think this is a very important point. But the fact that we have this imagination of thinking about a pandemic like an earthquake, like a tsunami, I think has also something to do with ways of thinking about a pandemic that is beyond human control. We're thinking about it as if we have no control over this. It happens to us, right? Almost like a natural, disaster, almost supernatural. So thinking about it, it's like, totally beyond us, beyond our control. No, it's wrong. This is not true. We are responsible. And in fact, of course, we all have stakes in this, but we're also partly responsible for like emerging infectious diseases happening almost every day. You can have like a new virus or a new infectious disease that can emerge out of nowhere, right? In fact, these happen all the time, but not every single one of them turns to these, global pandemic proportions. What is important is, doing like effective surveillance, especially in parts of the world where you see ecological change, and of course we're in a climate crisis. We are experiencing a very catastrophic levels of extinction and mass of biological, loss in biomass and biological diversity and ecological destruction. And all of these are important to think about the emergence of pandemics. So yes, we are responsible, I would say. It doesn't help us, it doesn't serve us well to think about pandemics as something beyond our controls. And in fact, we all need to be more kind of taking responsibility in trying to understand that this is something that can be predicted and also controlled in the sense that there are ways of stopping pandemics even before they reach catastrophic levels. There are methods, scientific methods of surveillance and controlling them, before they even take place. So there are, I think, we have today the scientific expertise and the know-how and the accumulation of knowledge to be able to control pandemics before they get to this point. So in this sense, I think, of course, this has very long and complex historical reasons why we don't want to take agency and just want to think of pandemics as kind of like, external phenomenon in which we don't want to take responsibility in a way, or it's also easier to blame the other. And of course, this also takes us to the question of, Eurocentrism, which, I'm happy to talk more about in the context of a plague, but even in the context of our current day pandemic. When did, for example, mainstream international media talking about COVID-19, especially after it started affecting Europe and the US, I mean, the Western world, right? So again, that's, already in itself that tells us a lot about, whose lives, whose bodies and whose lives are we talking about that are, seen as more valuable than others. At the same time, of course, there are ways of thinking about pandemics that we have inherited from the past. And I think, a Eurocentric and a colonialist approach that are really relevant in thinking about pandemics, linking it to historical patterns of thinking in our current day pandemic. But at the same time, during this pandemic, and I think we kind of lived real time problems related to, blaming the other, right? It's always easier to blame others instead of taking responsibility yourself. And I think, there are ways of deflecting just, responsibility that perhaps, for some people, this is something because they don't want to think about this, or perhaps it's easier to blame somebody else on an individual level. But when this happens as something that you find from like political leadership, for example, that's really dangerous and problematic. And we saw increased like xenophobic and racist movements in the US in earlier in the pandemic against, East Asian populations in particular. And that's just not acceptable. And in fact, when you look at historical pandemics, you have examples in which, like scapegoating, persecuting racial and ethnic and religious minorities as a behavior that happened in history. But it's, incredibly terrifying to see that it is still going on. So I think in many ways, I think we can say that our past formulae of thinking, past ways of thinking and imagining pandemics that we have inherited, kind of that legacy still goes on in many ways. And one of it is that, as I just mentioned, just thinking of pandemics as short-term phenomena instead of long-term processes, but also as something that belongs to, wherever you're looking at the world from your own, local perspective. In fact, regional and local perspectives, as valuable as they may be, unless you're, prioritizing or privileging a certain perspective over the others, really, we need to shift to more global perspectives and thinking about a pandemic really in its largest spatial definition is really what's going to help us understand it, right? Even with the question of vaccination, this is still very much relevant for our discussion today. The inequalities and problems of vaccine distribution, equity issues, and we will continue to, the pandemic will just get prolonged longer and longer if we cannot deal with those problems effectively. And again, that's a problem of privileging your own position over the others. Whereas if we really adopted a global perspective, we would develop means and methods to address it more efficiently, one would hope.
Yeah.
Right?
Especially during COVID-19, we are trying to avoid responsibilities and, blame others. How about...
It's easier.
Yeah,
it's easier. I think it's easier. We're lazy. We're just being lazy in that way. But, I don't want to sound too pessimistic at the same time, because we also saw just fantastic, examples in like across the humanity, across the globe, people who've been working so hard to help others, like, the sacrifices, the medical professionals and researchers and frontline workers. And so there's a lot of behavior that also needs to be acknowledged and reason for hope. So I don't want to sound all pessimistic. Yeah.
So how about like a in like a Justinian plague and also the Black Death? Were these like a avoiding responsibility and blaming others? Like you mentioned about scapegoating, but was it identical right now, like in COVID-19, or were there any differences in how people react and how policies were?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there are things that we can say were similar, but of course, we're talking about different societies, different time periods, different cultures, different belief systems, different social structures. And so, of course, there were differences. But what I would emphasize as being, similar are those kinds of responses that you would expect from any human society, independent of when they lived, where they lived, who they were. And some of these responses really have something to do with like some deeper level human responses, such as, for example, fear, right? Or the motivation and desire to protect your loved ones, right? Or any kind of like attachments that define your social bonds, either within the family or within your community, or other forms of social tension that arises in times of crises, right? So with that regard, I think we can basically think of these as like a general templates that we can use to adapt to different historical contexts. And I will still give us at least a basic outlook in trying to interpret and understand human behavior. Again, I'm not saying the human behavior did not change, but I think there are some recognizable similarities. And let's take the example of scapegoating, since we, have already started talking about that question. You can find examples of it in many different societies. It takes a different form in different contexts, but the idea of blaming some other group of people, either because they were different in terms of their belief, their ethnic origins, their skin color, or just beliefs, or any other reason, because they were different, it was basically enough for them to be kind of shown as a target during a time of stress. Let's think of the effect of the pandemic here, or just basically, any epidemic. Could be a smaller outbreak or a larger one like this. It's like a global pandemic, but it triggers a certain set of emotional response, being, fear and terror, uncertainty about the future, or like stress on sharing economic resources, like all of these, being important questions in times of stress. And that brings to the core the fault lines, the tensions, the already existing, pre-existing problems within a community or a society. And so basically any group that holds lesser social power would be, or can easily be, blamed for bringing the disease or causing the disease or spreading the disease, right? Conspiracy theories, they're nothing new. For anyone who thinks that, COVID is the beginning of conspiracy theories, no, unfortunately, they're very old. Perhaps they're as old as humanity, though we can say that, electronic communication and, social media maybe contributed to like faster spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories. But you have those in the past. You have just a very simple example that comes to mind. For example, in medieval Europe during the Black Death, there were rumors that Jewish groups, Jewish populations were poisoning the wells, water wells, as a cause of, plague, spreading plague. But of course, like we know for a fact that like that has nothing to do with reality. But it doesn't matter. What matters is what people believed and whether that rumor motivated them to act on it, right? And today, I think it's a perfectly comparable example in the sense that, all these conspiracy theories going on, about COVID. I don't even want to name them because there are so many. But what really the content of the conspiracies really doesn't even matter. What matters is its effectiveness and its power in mobilizing people, in mobilizing them in shaping their perspective and in guiding their behavior. For example, if someone believes in these conspiracies and refuses to get vaccinated, that's a problem, right? And then it doesn't even matter what the content of the conspiracy is, right? What matters is that people believe in them as truth. But we live in an age of post-truth, so anything is possible, right? Unfortunately.
Yeah. You talked about, in order to understand the pandemics, not only the disease itself, but it's important to think about the people, society. So if you can think, when you remind yourself of reading descriptions of Justinian plague, the Black Death, and witnessing the COVID-19, what are 2 or 3 characteristics of the society that was highly resilient to the pandemic, the plague?
Yeah, great question. Because, as much as we talk about these behaviors that don't really serve human societies well, such as denial, or scapegoating, or any other response that they're not beneficial for societies, we can also talk about, and perhaps even more importantly, emphasize about the resilience aspect and all sorts of behaviors that people engaged in that help them improve them in terms of, improving their institutional structure, legal structure, their knowledge in science and medicine, and effective ways of dealing with the pandemic. So all of these means of resilience, I think, is really what we can think of as what served the human societies in the past so that they survived pandemics. And let's just think back a little further back in time, thinking about the Justinianic plague or the Black Death, again, being, very important examples of plague. But we can even think of earlier examples and see that plague or other infectious diseases had an impact in shaping societies and changing them, in fact, changing them irreversibly, transforming them to new social structures so that they could survive new impacts, right? New phenomenon. And in many ways, we can think about, for example, we can think of practices of body hygiene. And as early as you want to trace them back in history, just, maybe even think about how certain religions have incorporated these notions about cleaning, hygiene, or whether certain types of food are permissible to eat or not. So, I'm just thinking of ancient history and at least using as at least one manifestation in which these principles that people may have learned from their experiences with past pandemics developed insights about how to protect themselves and their families. And some of it, I believe, survived in religions, right? Don't eat this food, or, eat this food, or even social taboos or social customs, non-written rules of living. I think most of these are kind of directed at protecting health and also helping your like family and friends and loved ones, right? So in many ways, I think we can find traces of these past trauma in prehistorical societies. When we look at more recent history, just, perhaps the last 2,000 years in particular, we can find traces of resilience in societies, in the development of public health systems, development of medical knowledge, development of many different ways of institutionalized forms of public health intervention. I mean, even when you think about the history of, for example, isolating a patient of an infectious disease from others, right, in a hospital ward, or even just thinking of how to define an outbreak, isolating an index case, what we call the index case. Some call it actually patient zero, but that can become problematic in some cases, as we know. So even the development of these basic ideas of how to handle a public health crisis, how to develop ways of fighting or responding to an epidemic crisis, right? Means of disinfection, how to keep cities clean, for example. Even this, like when we look at the history of all these practices, all these institutions, all these legal efforts to govern and rule cities and turn them into healthier places, I think at some point in history, I'm not trying to suggest that plague or pandemics really caused all of this, but I would argue that all of the accumulated wisdom that you see with respect to public health and medicine at some point have been shaped or transformed by experiences of epidemics and pandemics. And we can think of many examples about this. Public health itself, I think, is directly or indirectly, there may be, a debate about this, but is this kind of a way of dealing with such health crisis, right? On a population level. So I think, means of resilience, really going back to learning about a catastrophic experience and drawing lessons and turning them to principles that you can apply to your everyday life or to your institutions or to your science, and just kind of, using it as a guiding principle to for a society. But I think when we talk about resilience, we tend to think of social aspects of a society. And I think there is another component to it that we might just want to think about a little bit. And in terms of biological resilience, I think we should also think about how our bodies and our genetic evolutionary tendencies develop ways of dealing with this. I mean, because, this happens on a time scale different than human life or societies or like the historical time scale. So it's more difficult and more elusive in some cases to talk about, our evolutionary genetic responses to pandemics. But I think looking into historical pandemics, especially the history of those infectious diseases that affected human societies for a very, very long time, you can find traces in which we basically develop some response to an infectious disease that protect us. Mm-hmm. At least those societies that developed those genetic characteristics survived. I mean, just, as a kind of interesting, for example, one genetic mutation that developed during plague outbreaks today is something that causes another genetic disorder. It's kind of like not well known internationally, and there's been new research about this. Familial Mediterranean fever is a genetic disorder, is caused by a genetic mutation that protected people historically from plague.
Wow.
And you can find examples of this from other diseases. So when we talk about resilience, like we think more of social and political and economic and institutional aspects of it. But at the same time, I guess we are also resilient beings, biologically. So yeah, I think it's important to think about that as well.
Exactly. We have to consider microscopic and also macroscopic scales of resilience.
Exactly. It's very well put. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so not only the society in a bigger scale, but also internally, like immunity is also very important. So being aware of these, like a comprehensiveness is very important.
Right. I was just going to say, I mean, just thinking about these different components kind of, in a way, it forces us to think of like different scales, as you mentioned, like, either the microscopic or the macroscopic scale, but at the same time shifting scales of temporality, right? When you're looking of like a lifetime of a human being, or even just a state, or like a political time period, or of a century, right? Maybe it's not enough to trace some of these like deeper changes. So I always find it interesting to think of like larger temporal and spatial scales, because when you change the scale, you might see something entirely new. So it's just a matter of like, sometimes you need to zoom in on something to get a closer look as a historian, but sometimes you need to zoom out to see something different. So these are different techniques that can help us, shift our thinking to be able to detect different patterns.
Exactly. One of the interesting aspects about your research is that the reason I got intrigued about your studying is about the article about death, which was from Black Death to COVID-19, pandemics have always pushed people to honor and death. And as a historian who study people's death more often than other researchers and other fields of study, I think you have more awareness about the death and more, access about death and the meaning of the death and life. So how has this more access to death has personally impacted your life as an individual and also as a researcher?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this question. I actually, as I work on plague, I'm also working on another new book project on the history of death. And it kind of, I think the two go in a way hand in hand in trying to help me understand a very complex problem, and thinking about and writing about and learning about death and its historical study, as well as plague. I think they converge on some level. And one thing that I came to realize after many years of studying plague is that, well, this is also, pandemics are also, well, let me try to put it this way. You cannot study a pandemic without understanding or thinking about death, because it is of central importance for a pandemic experience. I came to this realization before this pandemic started, and I was already writing about and thinking about this question. But during this pandemic, it became crystal clear for me on many levels, both as a historian, but as someone who is living in the midst of a pandemic and thinking about, all the different accounts I read about, all the different stories I hear about, and everything, including what you see on the media, or what you hear from friends and family and my students. And so in a way, I think it's a story of death as much as of a story of disease. So for me, at least as a scholar working on these questions, I find it helpful to try to combine the history of death and history of disease. And you might think that this is intuitive. You might think that this already makes sense. But when you think about historical discipline and historical study of these subjects, you would be surprised to hear that history of disease and history of death are positioned almost like entirely separate and different areas of study. And it might not seem very interesting or revolutionary to think or to say that they're connected, but actually they're like so different from each other that historians don't think of them as connected subjects. So I think that's the first thing that I wanted to highlight. At the same time, I think this pandemic also helped me realize, and this is also something I see in the study of historical pandemics, the perception of death changes during pandemics. Death becomes more visible. Death becomes something that people talk more about, and we feel closer to death than we ever do, right?
Yes.
And it is hard in the modern world because the modern world and the capitalist economy is basically built on the premise that we should live like we're never going to die, that we're always going to be young and we will always continue to consume, right?
Denial of death, yeah.
So death almost like disappeared from the modern world, right? I mean, you cannot sell people stuff if you just remind them of their own mortality.
Exactly.
So, of course, I'm not the first to say this. Many, historians have pointed out this issue before. They even talk about the death of death in the modern world, right? And in fact, when you look at historical time periods, especially before the modern period, you see that death and perceptions toward death and even handling of the dead bodies are things that are very different from our modern practices and modern notions. And so I think it's important to think about that change. But at the same time, even where we are today, during this pandemic, just thinking about our own mortality, but also thinking about that death is also a part of life, at least to me, is a helpful and healthy way of thinking about pandemics, both present and modern.
Mm-hmm. So in the 13th to 15th century Mediterranean region, how were the perceptions on death of people? Were it different from, like, did they dance with the death, or was there like death of death? How were people's perception?
Yeah, well, there are certain things that I think we can say. First of all, I believe and I argue in my own work that a massive pandemic of plague, the Black Death, had a very important impact in changing people's attitudes and perception of death. Death became more prevalent just because of the sheer numbers of increased mortality. We're talking about a disease that historically killed maybe 50, maybe 60%, maybe even more of any society we're talking about the very high mortality rate. And just for a minute, imagine to compare it with COVID-19. The mortality rate is like 2% at most that was been in different parts of the world, and more like 1% or even less. We're talking about a bacterial infection, a bacterial disease in the case of plague that kills maybe 2 out of 3 people in every infection, right? Everybody touches. So it's extremely frightening to have, just think about like 3 people in one room, right? That 2 will die within a matter of like weeks, which must have transformed societies on a very deep level that maybe we can't even understand today. So in many respects, I think, the visibility of death and even the imminence of death, that's something that is so near, so close. I mean, there are historical accounts that I read in my work of like parents losing several children to plague and burying them, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Within the same family, right? What does this mean? I mean, I'm thinking about this historical account that talks about like funerals going on in and out of the city all the time. Just what did it mean for people to experience the death of their loved ones, their family members, neighbors every day? I mean, I think we kind of, we forgot, or we don't even know what it means to live in a world like that level of uncertainty. Even like with COVID, and of course, I'm not underestimating its impact, but it's nowhere near,
exactly.
comparable levels when we're, I think it's very hard to understand some of it, how people experienced it on an emotional level. On a more factual level, I think we can talk about like some practices that emerged during and after the Black Death that kind of help us understand a little about how death becomes integrated to life and how life and death are seen as like two sides of the same coin. And I think, like dance of death is one example to think about it, even though I think we have examples of it coming from Europe exclusively, as far as I know. Just thinking about new ways of perhaps embracing death, but also celebrating life and survival.
Exactly.
And I think, our predecessors, our ancestors had these traumatic experiences and survived and just developed some ways of making meaning out of them. And perhaps, as crazy as it may sound to us, like seeing dancing skeletons, right? Perhaps that's kind of the experience they developed and part of the resilience that you also asked about earlier.
So what do you think is the importance of pandemics or diseases in shaping humans' history? Is it like are there like important lessons after these all sufferings, or what's the meaning? What's the importance of these pandemics after all?
I mean, there are many lessons that we can draw from, or there are many types of meaning that we can talk about. What I would like to emphasize is really to understand that like humans are not the master of the universe, master of the world, or master of the living world even, and that adopting a human-centric perspective will not really get us far. We need to think more about ourselves as one of the species that live on the surface of the world, that we're sharing this natural world with others, and somehow we forget and we think of, it's only our perspectives that counts. I mean, this also brings me to at least mention the question about the spread of COVID among the wildlife, which in the long term, I mean, we already have evidence that it is spreading. I mean, like not only like mink farms and zoo animals and pets that, we all heard about this, but, in the deer population in the US, for example, and there are millions of them. So once COVID takes root in wildlife, wild animals, it will become almost impossible to eradicate. I mean, that's the story of like plague. It's the same story, right? Historically, most of these are zoonotic infections, and in fact, more than 75% of all human infections are of zoonotic origin, meaning that they came to us from animals. Once there is an animal reservoir, which means an animal population that keep this infection alive, it becomes almost impossible to eradicate that disease from the world. In fact, I am afraid that's where we're headed with COVID.
Yeah, exactly. In one of your articles about the death, you mentioned that pandemics never mean death and suffering for all. There is a strong evidence that Black Death survivor experienced better living standard and increased prosperity. How is this possible?
Yeah, I mean, it might sound a little counterintuitive, but we have evidence that that was the case. There is research coming from bioarchaeology, mainly looking at graves of individuals who died from plague, and we can learn this by doing tests in the lab, getting samples from human skeletons and especially teeth. Human teeth will reveal whether a certain individual died of plague or another infection. It's something that we can find out today. So when you look at the bioarchaeological evidence, there are ways of understanding if people had. And if you're comparing it to pre and post-plague population, there are ways of understanding if people had better standards of living, whether they lived longer, whether they suffered, more or less health issues, whether their level of nutrition was better or worse. So all of these, are based on research and metrics that can help us understand whether people had better living standards or not. At the same time, we have historical sources that kind of corroborate the evidence that comes from bioarchaeology, in the sense that, for example, every time there is a plague outbreak, you see that the survivors would have access to better housing, increased wages, and generally speaking, more prosperity, economic prosperity, right? It just think about a very, very simple, economic model of supply demand relationship. Think about, in an old city, think about the number of houses. All of a sudden, the population declines, and you have some houses that are open, but nobody can claim, right, in terms of property and the supply. And so there are many ways in which plague can, of course, any other dramatic mortality event can change those structures. At the same time, when you're in cities, and again, I'm talking about the historical plague pandemics, maybe Black Death and others after that. So you have a working population and labor force, right? All of a sudden, think of it that it kind of decreased by 50%. Who is going to do the work? You would pay more to hire laborers, right? So labor all of a sudden becomes a more valuable. So it's just, I think it's a basic, supply and demand kind of reaction. I mean, these kind of change over time, but relatively speaking, the time following an outbreak and a high mortality event would bring better physical and economic circumstances for survivors.
So you mentioned that you are going to write your next book about the history of death. I'm highly intrigued by it because, there aren't a lot of history books about death. And, as a death enthusiast, it might sound more of it. I'm really intrigued by it. Could you briefly introduce what your next book is going to be about? And could you maybe introduce one interesting perceptions of death that you thought, wow, I didn't expect this, but this is very interesting?
Well, thank you. It's great to hear that you find it interesting. The history of death is something that I am probably going to limit more to Ottoman history of the Ottoman Empire, and to the early modern period. So it's going to look at Ottoman history between, let's say, 14th to 17th centuries or so. I mean, I want to talk a little bit about the Black Death itself and its impact also. I think I can give one example, and that would be about how cemeteries are formed in again, just giving an example from the history of the Ottoman Empire. we don't have regulations in place about where people could be buried in the earlier centuries of the Ottoman Empire. So basically, when someone died, they could be buried, where they wanted to, or next to family members, right? But no designated place where individuals, were to be buried, and something that is enforced by the state until the end of the 15th, the beginning of the 16th century in the imperial capital, Istanbul, Constantinople, the city just came up earlier in our conversation. So where we see the earliest regulations for burial place, in which actually has a very close connection with plague, because at times of plague, they started burying the dead outside the city walls because they believed that the corpses were infectious and could spread disease to the living. In fact, this is not true. The dead, in the case of plague, they are not infectious and they cannot transmit the disease, right? But that's what people believed at the time. So they wanted to bury the dead as far away as possible from the cities. So they carried dead bodies outside the city walls. And, the city, of course, just think of all medieval cities like surrounded by walls and just, having like little gates going out where you can just control, the flow in and out of cities. So they would take the dead outside the cities. So the city would be the city of the living and the dead would be outside, right? So kind of separating the physical world of the living and the dead is something that, I think makes an interesting story in itself in trying to help us understand the perceptions of death. Death as something that could be regulated and regimented, right? I mean, I shouldn't say death, but the dead bodies and the burial process as something that could be controlled by the state and regimented and controlled and disciplined in a way and governed by the state, and the state making these decisions about like who could be buried where. And we see the development of these cemeteries also important to think about. For example, people of different religion were to be buried in different cemeteries. Like, Muslims would be buried in one cemetery, Christians and Jews would be buried in different cemeteries, right? Thinking about how the state assumed this role of making a decision of who was going to be buried where. I mean, I find these questions interesting, and I think this would require maybe another longer conversation about it. But I think, that would be one example that comes to mind as, changing attitudes toward death.
Yeah, one of the interesting thing in South Korea is that because a lot of residents worry that the land price will drop once the cemetery is nearby their house, they always like a protest whenever some like a death facilities like a cemeteries. So the government always try to make a cemetery outside the city and the suburbs. So the main problem is that I heard that in France, they put the cemeteries near the cities always so that people can walk by and always think about the death. But in capitalistic societies, we can see that cemeteries are put away and then people try to deny the presence of death. And then I think this is pretty noticeable to see, especially in the modern societies.
I mean, thank you for bringing the example of in South Korea. And I think that's probably the case in many other, urban areas in the world, because, it's something that affects property values. So nobody wants to live in, close to a cemetery. I mean, in the case of Paris or any other kind of older cities that have like a, pre-modern, longer pre-modern history, you have evidence of the formation of these cemeteries that were once outside the cities, But like when the cities grew, those cemeteries basically became a part of the city, right? And but also, we can think about like, how people interact with that space. I mean, is it something like, scary, spooky, or like you don't want to be near? Or is it somewhere that you can just, take a walk or contemplate about life and death, right? So what we're trying to do, and in fact, this probably has a very long history, that we're trying to push death out. Just maybe the first step is kind of physically push out, like, because like what you don't see is like, if you don't see, you don't think about it, right? Out of your vision and out of your out of sight, out of mind. So but I think there are very kind of different stages of it. And so yeah, I mean, in the core of it is this desire to keep it out.
My last question for today is, do you have any advice for young people in the midst of uncertainties, death, loss of life, loss of love, especially during COVID-19? Any advice for young people or students?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question. I don't know what would be helpful for everyone, because everyone has a different way of dealing with uncertainty and anxiety. For me, what I find helpful is to learn. And as I learn more about something, I just find comfort in learning. Whether people want to engage with this by just reading literature or just talking to friends, that would also be a good way of dealing with it, I guess. What comforts me is like to learn more about it and to go deeper in the study of something, to be able to I guess to reduce anxiety and to find comfort, and just to think about it, thinking about it as part of the human experience. Really better, whether it's like a current day problem or a past problem, just taking the perspective of another person, another human being at a different time, different culture, just exercising a way of just shifting your perspective to, the perspective of another person. In fact, I give homework assignments for my students about the pandemic, is to write a paper first about their own pandemic experience. The second paper is about writing about the pandemic experience of someone entirely different from them. Just, another person, another country, another language, another religion, something just entirely different from them. So they can just, try to shift the lens to just think about the perspective of another person. And just the paper after that is to write the story of COVID-19 from the perspective of the virus. Try to put yourself in the shoes of, the virus and try to tell the story. It's all about shifting perspectives, right? I mean, I think that makes you a better historian, but that makes you a better person. Indeed. If you can just, build empathy and to understand the perspective of other people, of like the past or the present, of another religion, of another society, or even just taking the perspective of a non-human being, right? Like an animal or a virus. And I don't know how much we want to sympathize with the virus, but I think it's definitely helpful to build empathy and to build, different perspectives in our thinking. I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, indeed. For me personally, as I learned more about pandemics and the death, I became more humble. And then I began to, wonder about the mysteries of death. And then the more knowledge and the more perspectives we gain, our ego tends to be smaller, and we become awestruck by the vastness of this nature. And then for young people, I think that is indeed very important, because we are surrounded by the capitalistic and materialistic properties, and we tend to be oblivious to those presence of the pandemics and death, and then that is very important.
Yeah, I mean, I think you were absolutely right that humility is really key here to emphasize. And as a student of history, you never lose sight of having those like multiple perspectives as you read more about the experiences of others. I mean, this doesn't have to be history. Art can do the same, or literature can teach you the same. Even science, or even just, other ways of interacting with the world can do it, as long as you listen and you kind of open up yourself to the perspective of others. Yeah.
Exactly. For the listeners, if you are more curious about Dr. Varlık's works, her books such as The Plague and Empire in the Early Mediterranean World, The Ottoman Experience, and also her upcoming book, which is about the history of death. And then if you're curious about the death, you can also read From Black Death to COVID-19 Pandemics Have Always Pushed People to Honor and Death, which I'm going to put on the link below. So thank you so much for the conversation today. I learned a lot from you.
Great. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for your questions.